Well, hello everyone. I hope you can all hear me loud and clear. I'd like to welcome you all. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning potentially, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to Engineering for Change, or E4C for short. Today we're pleased to bring you our the first installment of our 2018 webinar series on the topic of how cities are managing their transportation growing pains. My name is Yana Aranda, and I'm president here at E4C, and I'm pleased to be your moderator for today's webinar. The webinar you're participating in today will be archived on our webinars page and our YouTube channel. Both of those URLs are listed on the slide you see in front of you. Information on upcoming webinars is also available on our webinars page. E4C members will receive invitations to upcoming webinars directly. If you have any questions, comments, or recommendations for future topics and speakers, please contact the E4C Webinar Series team at the email listed on the slide. If you're following us on Twitter today, I'd like to invite you to join the conversation with our dedicated hashtag, #E4CWebinars. Now, before we move on to our presenter, I'd like to tell you a bit about Engineering for Change. E4C is a knowledge organization and a global community of more than 1 million engineers, designers, development practitioners, social scientists who are leveraging technology to solve quality of life challenges faced by underserved communities worldwide. Some of these challenges include access to clean water and sanitation, sustainable energy, improved agriculture, innovative infrastructure, and more. We invite you to become a member of E4C. Membership is free and provides access to news and thought leadership, insights on hundreds of essential technologies in our solutions library, professional development resources, and current opportunities such as jobs, funding calls, fellowships, and more. E4C members also enjoy a unique user experience based on their site behavior and engagement. Essentially, the more you interact with our site, the better we will be able to serve you resources aligned to your interests. For more information and to sign up, please visit our website. Now, a few housekeeping items before we get started. We'd like to practice using the WebEx platform, so I invite you to tell us where in the world you are. Using the chat window, which is located at the bottom right of your screen, please type in your location. If the chat is not open on your screen, try clicking the chat icon on the top right corner. And I'll go ahead and get us started. Okay, so I see there's some folks here who are joining us from Florida, from San Diego, from Colorado, Australia, California, New York City, Newburgh, Indiana, Ohio, all over the United States, and more. We're so excited to have you join us. All right. Kazakhstan. This is the first time I've had someone join us from Kazakhstan. Welcome. How exciting. All right. Very good. I see everyone's using, it's 4 a.m. in the UK. Early good morning to you, for sure. So we're excited to have you join us here today. If you don't see the chat window, again, a reminder, there's a link on the top of the screen. During the presentation, please use the Q&A window, which is below the chat, to type in your questions for our presenter. Again, if you don't see it, click the icon at the top right corner. That way we can keep track of all of our questions. You can use the chat to send any private messages to the Engineering for Change admin should you have any issues. Now, if you're listening to the audio broadcast and encounter any trouble, try hitting stop and then start. You may also want to try opening up WebEx in a different browser. For those of you who are professional engineers, E4C webinars qualify you for 1 professional development hour. To request your PDH, please follow the instructions on the top of the E4C professional development page after the presentation. The link is shown here on the slide. Now, let me move on to the next slide here. I'd like to take a moment now to tell you a bit about today's webinar and our presenter. As you may be aware, rapidly growing cities in developing regions are experiencing unique challenges and opportunities for innovation in transportation and a more sustainable future for all. Today, we're very pleased to be joined by Darina Poyani, who is a senior lecturer at the School of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Queensland and co-author of the Urban Transport Crisis and Emerging Economies. Dr. Poyani will take us through select case studies and enlighten us to the urban issues, policies, and initiatives that are taking place in frontier markets. Dr. Poyani joined University of Queensland's planning program as a lecturer in 2015. She received tenure and was promoted to senior lecturer in 2017. Originally from Albania, she lived, worked, and studied in Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, and the U.S. prior to moving to Australia. In 2016 to 17, she was a visiting lecturer at the University of Vienna, Austria. Her research interests encompass urban transport, urban design, and housing. She has published books and numerous articles on urban planning, and she's going to give us insights into her latest work on today's webinar. Thank you for joining us, Darina, and I turn it over to you.
Hi, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar. I'll get started right away. I'll be presenting today the findings from my latest book called The Urban Transport Crisis in Emerging Economies, which was just published last year by Springer. The book covers 12 of the major world economies in developing countries. Most of those are located in the global south, but not all of them. And if you look at the slide, it's the countries that are marked in white color. Now, the inspiration from the book, or the idea, came from this observation that a lot of the cities of the global south or the developing world are looking more and more the same because of their transportation systems. So they've come to be dominated by congestion rather than traditional landmarks such as, for example, monuments or plazas or squares. And here I have just a few examples. Now, another observation is that urban transport seems to be perverse in that it tends to become worse when cities get wealthier, while other policy areas like education or healthcare improve. And of course, an inefficient and polluting urban transport system affects households, individuals, businesses, the community at large. It has major effects on health and on the environment, but also on urban economies and social development, and no less social inclusion. At the same time, urban transport is one of the keys to a more sustainable and human urban future in the 21st century. So after this introduction, I'll talk a bit about the presentation itself. It will be structured according to strategies or interventions. We have grouped those into 9 categories, and this framework also comes from my prior work. On the slide, it's listed on the right-hand side, the article where this particular framework comes from. And to make it extra clear, the list of interventions is color-coded by least desirable towards most desirable interventions. So I'll start with the first one, investments in road construction. So these historically have been considered sort of the magic wand to resolve all manner of urban transport problems. So the predict and provide paradigm has been very present in the global south. The problem is that it has been shown both theoretically and empirically that the benefits of building new roads or increasing the capacity of existing roads are are commonly offset by this phenomenon called induced demand. Increased road capacity commonly results in the diversion of travel from lower volume hours of the day, parallel commuting routes, or public transportation. And in a very short time, congestion levels are restored to almost pre-expansion levels. So there is this vicious circle at play. So some people will say that this type of approach, trying to resolve congestion issues by expanding roads, is like trying to cure obesity by buying bigger pants. And it doesn't work. However, this continues to be a typical policy response in most of the countries that we covered in the book. Here is a picture from Ankara, an urban highway that became congested very soon after its completion. The picture was provided by the author of the Turkey chapter, Ela Babalık. Now, the problem with this approach is not just that it's theoretically ineffective, but it also presents a social inclusion issue because the roads are mainly used by an elite minority that owns cars. In developing countries, we see a situation as different to, say, the United States or Australia, where the majority of people have cars. Here we're talking about just a very top slice of the population owning cars, and increasing road capacity also produces more and more urban sprawl as development tends to follow roads. Now, the mentality among policymakers in emerging economies is changing, but not quickly enough. So we see more of a rhetorical change towards moving away from traditional road construction. But the reality is that more money is put into roads than alternative modes. I'll talk about that next. Another area where a lot of money tends to be put or tends to be spent is parking, which also consumes large amounts of space in the cities of emerging economies. And some of those cities are only starting to realize that parking, especially free parking, comes at a very high cost. Now I'll move on to the next area of the next strategy type, investments in rail-based transport. I wanted to cover first theoretically the two main types of rail-based transport, light rapid transit, LRT, or heavy rail, or metro transport. So LRT is present in the cities of developing countries, and it ranges from the conventional on-street tramways, such as the example of this Moscow tram presented on the picture on the left-hand side, and all the way to the elevated systems of places like Singapore. It tends to be present only in the wealthier cities of developing countries. It has, of course, lower construction costs than metros, and it positively impacts air quality in the cities where it is present because it runs on electricity as opposed to petrol, like buses. Generally, cities that build LRT signal this more permanent commitment to public transport. So it's desirable in the sense of image. But then when it comes to operations, if LRT operates simply at grade without much priority other traffic, it really has not a major operational advantage compared to busways, and I'll talk about busways in another slide. Then we have the case of heavy rail, metro. I've put up a picture, an example from Delhi's metro on the right-hand side. Now, the problem with metro is that it requires full segregation from other traffic because it's fed electricity from an electrified third rail. So, therefore, because it needs to be segregated, construction costs are the highest, although also the capacity is the highest because full segregation means that metros do not have to stop at traffic lights. There are no impediments on the way. So capital costs estimates vary from perhaps 8 million per kilometer for at grade kind of metros, if one can secure the right of way on the surface. But then costs escalate all the way to 150 million per kilometer for difficult terrain. And in fact, an already built up city that has major underground infrastructure can be considered difficult terrain because a lot of sewer lines and water lines would have to be displaced to accommodate metro systems. So that's in short the theory. Now let's move on to the practice. The reality is that only developing cities with a population of more than 2 or 3 million, places like Mexico City or Delhi, there's this one in the example in the picture, have in place metro systems. Most other cities just simply cannot afford them. They're too expensive. One exception is Chinese cities. China has been building a huge amount of rail transport, urban rail transport, since 1990, and it's been aided, of course, by its strong economy during this period. There is this great GIS graphic, which you can access through this link that I posted at the bottom of the slide. I've extracted the images of rail construction in three periods, 1990, 2000, and 2020. It shows the huge growth in urban rail in China, but otherwise you can look at the GIS for a more gradual growth to see the evolution. Now let's move on to another type of intervention, the promise of future technologies, and I'm covering only three. Of course, technology is just one word, but it encompasses quite a lot. So I'll cover biofuels, electric cars, and now the new invention, self-driving cars. So biofuels are, of course, less polluting at the point of view than conventional fuels, but when it comes to developing countries, the deployment of developing countries, the concern is that a lot of agricultural land might be used to produce biofuels for domestic use and for export, and then as a consequence, countries that adopt biofuel production in a major way might suffer food shortages. So that's one concern. Electric cars, another type of intervention. The problem here is that the pollution, yes, is lower at the point of use, but we need to look at the pollution during the whole lifetime of the car. So from the moment it's produced in a factory to the moment it's brought to the market, and then we also need to look at the afterlife of an electric car. And I've put here this pile of discarded batteries of electric cars, and this is a scenario that happens quite commonly in developing countries that do not have the facilities to recycle used batteries. So people who have crunched the numbers will say that the overall pollution might not be a lot less than conventional cars. And then we have the case of self-driving cars. It's perhaps too early to talk about their deployment in developing countries. So I'll only talk about this briefly. One concern is that with self-driving cars, we are looking forward to a future where robots will be making these moral decisions about what to do in the case of a potential accident. And if you'd like to look at a series of scenarios that present this moral dilemma that cannot be easily resolved by science, they're more philosophical questions, you can click on this link, Moral Machine at MIT.edu, and there you can see this more human perspective on moral decisions made by self-driving cars, and you can also test yourself, see what you would do if you're faced with a dilemma in traffic and it involves a self-driving car. Okay, so these are the main theoretical points I wanted to make regarding technology. But now what's the reality in emerging economies? What were the findings from the book? Well, it looks like technology is still too expensive for emerging economies, and a lot of the benefits at this point in time may be offset by rapid motorization. Also, we need to keep in mind that technological solutions cannot be some sort of panacea for urban transport problems. In fact, things like congestion cannot be solved by technology. Yes, the biofuels, electric cars, maybe they'll help with the solution, but they don't necessarily fix our cities. So behavioral change will be required to resolve a lot of these problems, and I'll talk about that more next. So the reality at this moment in time is that developing cities have been adopting the more inexpensive types of technologies in urban transport, so new mobility services via cell phone or on-demand parking payments, and there are versions of Uber that are very specific to certain cities, like Grab Bike, like in the picture here from Jakarta in Indonesia, or Didi Taxi, that's the Chinese version of Uber. There is some experimentation in different places with intelligent transport systems for general traffic management. And then in the case of India, there is this major mission to create 100 smart cities in the country, which will employ technology in a major way. But many experts are quite skeptical. They'll say that it's more political propaganda than a feasible kind of project. So generally, turning over the existing fleet of polluting vehicles has proven difficult, and that's one of the big priorities in the countries that we reviewed in the book. Okay, another type of intervention are pricing mechanisms, which charge the price to access a certain area of the city, typically the downtown area, like the example of cordon pricing applied in Tehran, Iran. That's what the illustration on the slide shows. Overall, the research in the book shows that there has been great political reluctance to introduce measures that curtail the use of cars and motorcycles. And even when benefits are accrued by congestion charging areas like the one in Tehran, these tend to be offset by the growing levels of motorization in many developing cities. We see experimentation with pricing and taxation schemes, but sometimes even these have been counterproductive. For example, in India, buses are taxed more than personal vehicles. And then I need to say that these types of schemes, they might have an effect, but it's only in a limited area. They don't have very large overall effects that cover the whole city. Another category of intervention are vehicle access restrictions. And developing cities have been experimenting with these, but with limited success. One relatively successful scheme is the Oino Circular scheme implemented in Mexico City, which prohibits cars from circulating 1 day a week based on license plate numbers. It has backfired to some extent when it was initially introduced, because some people purchase second and third cars to game the system. Overall, the effect has been positive. Then China is another country that has been trying to restrict private vehicle ownership by limiting the issuing of license plates. But overall, it's been difficult to restrict vehicle access. That's a general finding from the book. Another category is the strengthening of land use controls. And of course, this is not a transport intervention as such, but land use and transport have a very strong relationship. One cannot have very efficient public transport systems in very low density, sprawling kind of environments like the one here illustrated in the slide in Cape Town in South Africa. In these kind of environments, of course, private vehicles play the major role for moving people around. Some other characteristics of land use in emerging economies that then affect transport systems are these very dynamic urban development processes, mostly led by the private sector rather than by the government, very high construction levels in some cities to meet housing demand, but we also see increasing social polarization and segregation as countries grow wealthier. We haven't seen an equal distribution of that wealth, but rather just polarization at the extremes. And of course, that kind of polarization has spatial effects. We see more and more gated communities for the rich and the middle class who tend to cut themselves off from the rest of society. And this type of spatial inequalities, I feel they're perfectly illustrated in this picture from Sao Paulo that has made the rounds of the internet, where we see side to side one high-rise, very fancy development for the wealthy, right next door to a poor favela. Now, developing cities are slowly recognizing that they need to adopt better land use policies that encourage the use of public transport, but there is a big gap between rhetoric and practice. Another category of intervention is simply awareness-raising campaigns, and these can be quite low cost, have been taking place in many, many countries. One type of campaign is the World Car-Free Day that's celebrated in many countries on September 22nd every year. However, the success in reversing travel habits has been minimal. So many specialists at this point are saying that perhaps the focus should shift from awareness-raising campaigns for the population at large to professional training and education. And this has also proven difficult to do because a lot of countries in emerging economies, they suffer from brain drain. So they're better trained professionals, they move to the global north, and this phenomenon is partly responsible for the lack of reform. Now, one exception is India, where these centers of excellence in urban transport are being created that will provide financial assistance for professional training. But the effect remains to be seen. They're still relatively new. one type of intervention that is paramount, and you can see from the green color of the title in the slide, is road-based public transport. And I've distinguished this from rail-based public transport as more desirable, mainly because of its lower cost. So road-based public transport obviously includes conventional buses. Those do not tend to do much for the image of public transport in various countries, but fortunately now there is this higher level public transport system, bus rapid transit, which promises to deliver benefits that are similar to rail, but at much lower cost. And let me give you some basic information on BRT. So BRT has been developed all over the world. It started in Latin America, but it's spread now to Asia, and it's one type of intervention that was initially invented in the global south, and then it was exported into the global north. Usually the direction of policy transfer goes the other way around, so BRT is special in that way. And at this point, there's been plenty of research on BRT operations. There is strong evidence that these systems are appealing and effective. The landmark system is still, or the two landmark systems are still in Latin America, so Curitiba and Bogota, BRT systems and incipients. In Asia, the largest system is in Guangzhou in China. So this is for the positive side, but of course BRT is not a miracle cure either. So, and some BRTs of course have been more or less successful. It is a very complex type of transport planning, and some systems have suffered from fragmented planning or operational inefficiencies, political struggles during their design and then later implementation. Land acquisition can be a problem when designing a system in an already built city. There have been issues with cost overruns, although the system is more cost effective than rail, like I said. And in some cases, there has been this interaction with social equality issues, because BRT sometimes is also seen as a way to rehabilitate informal settlements, and so the interplay with social issues varies from country to country. Unfortunately, there have been a few cases of BRTs that were built and are already dismantled, like the case in Delhi. And we've also seen that in some countries, because the systems are higher quality than conventional buses or paratransit, informal transit, then the fares are also too high for the urban poor. So these are some of the issues to keep in mind when thinking of BRT. And then finally, support for non-motorized modes. One cannot stress enough how important non-motorized transport is for cities. And when we talk about a non-motorized transport, it's not just about having a sidewalk or having a bicycle lane, but it's also about the general feel of cities. For example, a city like the Chinese city here in this example, with this major highway that runs across the urban space, cannot be considered a pedestrian-friendly environment. This city is obviously dedicated to cars, so it's also a visual perception, not just about the practicalities of providing non-motorized infrastructure. Now, in the book, we found through the chapters that our authors wrote, we found that very few cities are currently currently inventing any substantial amounts in cycling and walking infrastructure. That's very unfortunate. So walking revolution in particular is not forthcoming. And wherever there are positive interventions, walking and cycling paths, this tends to be in small pockets or disconnected corridors. And cycling in particular is often seen as a leisure activity rather than form of everyday transport, especially for the middle and the upper classes. Attitudes are very, very slowly changing. But okay, apart from the negative, I also want to talk a bit about the positive. There are some examples that are at the forefront of non-motorized transport improvements. And one example is Bogota, which has already created some nearly 400 kilometers of segregated bicycle lanes, but that's quite unique in developing countries. Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro in Brazil are also developing quite large cycling networks. And then we have the case of China that used to be once cycling paradise at the height of the communist system. And then it sort of gave over its urban space to cars. And now it's trying once again to revive cycling. And one type of intervention is bicycle sharing programs, which are becoming more and more popular in cities across China. But these also sometimes have drawbacks, like in the case of Shenzhen, that is shown in the picture here on the right-hand side, the slide, where bicycles have been used, but then have been discarded, creating these eyesores and another environmental problem in the city. Okay, so in summary, I wish this had been a more cheerful presentation rather than listing all these problems and issues. But that's the reality. There is no point sugarcoating it. Most developing countries will need this radical overhaul of urban transport to improve the situation. And in most cases, packages of measures are needed. Disconnected interventions simply will not have a big effect. The trends that we see in developing countries now are similar to those experienced earlier by global north countries, but in the south, the problems are magnified because the south has many more mega cities, and the lack of resources is also a problem. Generally, there is a high level of dissatisfaction over the devastation of cities caused by urban traffic, but most places have very weak local traditions of public action, and this is, of course, the legacy of poverty, corruption, or totalitarian political systems, or post-colonial type of context. So many of the cities that we covered in the book, they do have high potential to overcome urban transport problems because the cities are dense enough. Some of the cities, not all, but some have retained this very strong pedestrian culture, and they also have substantial portions of carless households that would have nothing to lose from car traffic restrictions. But in practice, there are all sorts of transport governance arrangements that inhibit more effective development. Okay, so that was it for my part, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyani. This has been an incredibly rich overview of what the interventions are that you've seen to be the most high potential. and what the state of affairs is. With that, I would like to invite our participants to enter their questions into the Q&A window, and we'll start diving in. I already see some folks have already entered their questions. Let me just go through here. And while you are answering your questions, I'm going to kick us off with one question that came to mind for me when you were speaking around the high potential of addressing environmental performance of existing fleets, when you're talking about the technology-based solutions. Are you able to share some examples or something that you've seen in your research of successful approaches, or where that's been done effectively, and what some of the consequent interventions have been?
I would say that the two countries that appear to be at the forefront of technological innovation are China and India. And one of their big advantages is that they have domestic car production, so they can produce their own electric vehicles at lower cost. So they don't need to borrow technology from the north. But then I've also seen in my research on transport psychology and transport symbolism that often the middle classes and the higher income strata of those countries do not care so much about the symbolism of things like electric cars or hybrid cars, what are called, in combination with are called eco cars, unless these are associated with luxury brands like Mercedes-Benz or BMW, things like that. So a lot of middle-class people, they won't care to buy an electric Toyota if that doesn't add to the image of themselves and their families. The environmental friendly. So the environmental friendliness of the technology itself doesn't have that strong a symbolism yet in this context. And there is a big contrast with the global north, where using an environmentally friendly vehicle does give you sort of positive social capital. So think about all the Toyota Prius drivers in the United States. They're associated, with a certain environmentally friendly lifestyle, and that's not happening yet in the South.
Right. That makes good sense. So we have a couple of other questions that have come in. With ride-sharing becoming more popular, for example, Uber and spin-offs, motorcycle taxis, and et cetera, do you think that road transportation can be a more sustainable option in developing markets?
Road transportation is in car-based transportation, you mean?
I believe no. Here it says that there's the example of motorcycle taxis. I believe the question is more just noting that vehicle-based transportation, not exclusively necessarily cars.
Sure. I mean, in the case of motorcycles, we see the example of places like Vietnam, where motorcycles are used quite a lot, but generally in Southeast Asia. And up until now, the conventional wisdom has been that we also need to try and restrict motorcycle traffic as much as possible. But now this new thinking has emerged that perhaps motorcycle-based traffic is a lot more desirable than previously thought, because in a lot of Asia, motorcycle ownership is considered sort of a stepping stone towards car ownership. And then imagine what can happen if all those people that now use motorcycles suddenly switch to cars. It will cause major congestion. So in some places now the focus is shifted to keeping people on motorcycles rather than have them shift to cars.
Right. Interesting. So in terms of the buses, what questions have come in here regarding your thoughts on what developing countries can do to better implement green urban transportation, in this case, the example of electric buses for mass transportation.
I think that's already happening. Actually, it's a question of turning over the existing fleet, but like I said, the countries that have a domestic production are hugely advantaged there because they can produce electric buses at a lower cost. Other countries will always be disadvantaged if they have to purchase those cleaner technologies from elsewhere. I mean, it's desirable, but the potential is limited because of the cost.
So local manufacturing is inextricably linked to that capacity.
Yeah.
So one of the notes that you raised was regarding, this incredible example of road-based public transport and the unconventional migration of innovation from south to north relative to BRT. Are you able to share some examples? Are there any examples of also collaboration between the global south and north in addressing some of these issues, given that they are so rapidly evolving and there's so much learning to be shared across the barrier?
Oh, sure. I mean, collaborations go on all the time. It's not a question of individual examples. This is, I mean, we live in a connected world now, so policy diffusion is constantly happening. The question is translating policies, keeping in mind the local culture and psychology. That's all the focus now. I was talking before about the different symbolism that's attached to different technologies in the north and in the south. That's the kind of thing that takes a while to change. You can easily transfer the technology, but if a culture is not poised to accept it, then it's not going to work. That's really the main issue, rather than the technology itself. That's probably the easier part, transferring the technology. Changing culture and mentality, that's a process.
Right. I believe that in our own research, we've seen that, for example, and we're talking about non-motorized transport, and particularly in East Africa, walking, which is still a predominant mode of transportation in many African countries, is still perceived as a sign of poverty. So it's absolutely kind of, to me, resonating when you're speaking about that behavior change and perception being so critical, and the investment and awareness campaigns being an essential element of this work. So with respect to some of the things we've seen, are there any really disruptive solutions that you've seen that may have addressed some of these issues in a way that surprised you in doing this work?
Disruptive solutions. I would say BRT has been the major innovation in recent years. Perhaps bicycle sharing, smartphone-based bicycle sharing has also been, well, disruptive to some extent, and only for certain countries like China, not everywhere. And then the major disruptive technology we expect now is automated driving, of course, but I'd say it's too early to speculate about its effects in the north even, and then probably take a little bit longer even to be applied to the south. But I wanted to make another point when we're talking about walking being associated with poverty in Africa and in other parts of the global south. I wanted to say that if one is located in the global north, in cooler climates, it's easy to forget that a lot of cities in the south, they can have this very hot and humid climate. So the same technologies or behaviors that might work quite well in the north, they might not work just as well in the south. So what we see in a lot of Southeast Asia, for example, places that are in the tropical climate band, because it's so hot and humid outside, anybody who has achieved some level of economic success in life wants immediately to get out of the street and get into air conditioning, into private motorization and air conditioning. So that's why we see this sort of urbanism that's dominated by air-conditioned cars, air-conditioned shopping malls. With people with economic needs, they try to spend as little time as they can outdoors. And if one is based in places like the Netherlands, the bicycle kingdom, it's easy to forget these climatic factors.
Absolutely. It's a fantastic point. And we have a few more questions that have come in that are really interesting. One question here is there any evidence that investment in technologies like internet bandwidth lead to long-term changes in traffic patterns and the demand for the most congested parts of the cities? Essentially, does telecommuting and virtualization provide some hope for the future?
I don't think that's really the solution. And the reality is that there are already many countries in the south now that have quite good internet connections in the major cities, but the impact on traffic of those technologies has not been all that great. In fact, some cities in the south probably have better internet connection than what we have here in Australia. I'm struggling at the moment connecting to the webinar, but yeah, no, I don't think the impact on traffic has been great.
Is it fair to speculate that perhaps, coming back to your point about culture, in terms of work-life culture and expectation to be on site might have something to play with it? Again, I'm playing completely speculation here, a little bit of couch research here.
Yes. So two things going on. One, like you said, different work cultures in the north and in the south. Let's not forget that a lot of the south still operates under these, I don't want to say totalitarian, but perhaps authoritarian type of cultures. So then workplace culture is not as flexible as in the north. Telecommuting is not as acceptable. People, yes, are expected to be on site, and then hierarchies tend to be much stronger in the workplace, where which means that employees kind of have to defer to their supervisors, expected to be on time, and be there, physically be there. So that's one issue. Another issue which I mentioned earlier is that in a lot of countries the motorization is still increasing, so people are still purchasing cars. So whatever effects we see that might be due to technology, whatever positive effects, they're offset by increasing motorization at this point. So we're not in a equilibrium kind of state just yet. It's not like in the United States where there is already a saturated market with cars, and then we can measure the different effects of technology or other interventions. Here there are these two opposing forces at play.
Sure. I suppose time will tell how these dynamics shift and influence one another. It's very exciting. So are there any questions? There's actually some questions coming in through chat, or maybe some comments. If telecom companies are successful in the global south, why is it that transportation is lacking behind in the global south?
Could you repeat this last question, please?
Sure. I'm trying to derive this. This is a question I'm seeing in the chat, just for your reference as well, Dr. Biani. If telecom companies are successful in the global south, why is it that transportation is lacking behind in the global south? That's quite a broad question.
Yes. Well, so I think one big issue is the political system of the global south. So what we see is these two interlocking loops or vicious circles. One that sees cars as a necessity, and the other one that sees cars as a status symbol. And both of these loops, I believe, stem from the embrace of neoliberalism as the governing principle. So that means that either governments in the South are weak, or in some cases, previously strong governments have now retreated. And now this is, of course, compounded by things like corruption and dysfunctional post-colonial legacies, and then authoritarianism. But so what happens on one side of the loop works like this. So you have this neoliberal governance system. And then this leads to reduced investment in alternative forms of transport, public transport, cycling, walking. And then right after that, individual types of transport like cars or private transport solutions like shuttle buses to one's employment place provided by the employer, these are encouraged, so not things that are government-based like public transport for all. Then once this happens, car ownership becomes necessary to just get around efficiently in the city. And once car ownership is seen as necessity in life, then the government rushes to accommodate the needs of the car-growing elite, and this leads to further reductions in the quality of public transport and cycling infrastructure. So that's one side of the loop. Then we have the status, kind of so the psychological component. You have a neoliberal government, and it means that society becomes more unequal socially and financially. And then we know from research, economics research, that in societies that are more unequal, display of status becomes more important. So you need to clearly show through what you own where you stand in society. So the car you own, the car you drive, needs to place you right away in the social hierarchy. And then this becomes a status symbol, of course. And once cars are status symbols, then you've got these governments that rush to accommodate the needs of the car-owning elite, like I said, and this leads to further inequality. So there are these two loops at play that are difficult to break. And I don't think technology itself has the power to break these loops. It's more of a governance issue than a technological issue. I think technological optimism is perhaps unwarranted in this case.
You raise a tremendously good point, and thank you so much for connecting the dots across those entire loops. It's fascinating and enlightening, and I'm hopeful, again, not to end on a pessimistic note, but for all of our attendees and all of the folks that will listen to this webinar and the recording. And I do apologize, we're coming to time, so that was the last question. But there are other questions coming in. Please feel free to contact Dr. Biani via her email address or to webinars@engineeringforchange.org. But what is promising is that hopefully our listeners will now be thinking holistically about solutions and how policy and perception behavior will play into the overall betterment of our transportation quandaries that we are facing globally. With this, I would really like to thank Dr. Proiani for taking the time to spend with us today, for sharing her insights, and encourage all of you to pick up a copy of her book. This was just the tip of the iceberg from all the exciting and interesting insights inside. I'd like to thank you all for attending, joining us on today's webinar. There will be a recording of this webinar available. For those of you who are registered, you will receive a notification of that recording when it's ready. For those of you seeking professional development hours, the code is listed on our slide here. Please send us an email to request that professional development hour. And again, if we did not address your questions, email us at the webinars@engineeringforchange.org. With that, I'd like to wish you all a good evening or a good morning, depending where you are. Encourage you all to join us as E4C members to get information on upcoming webinars. And we hope to see you on our next one next month. Take care.